Hey there, A pushers. JB here. Today is Articles of Confederation versus the United States Constitution, a comparison of the written constitutions and scope of national power. This is basically key concept 3.22 in the curriculum framework. What we're going to do is we're going to break down the Articles of Confederation, what it could do and what it couldn't do, and why it eventually failed and led to the Constitutional Convention, which gave us the United States Constitution. And what we'll do is that we'll compare not just the two written documents, but also compare the aftermath of each of them once they were ratified and implemented as the frame of government for the nation. So, to continue the in-depth understanding of these two documents. Now, during the Revolution, the Second Continental Congress was trying to establish a form of government, but the states also wanted to establish a form of government. And basically, most state constitutions followed in the framework of their charters. However, they wanted to, in this age of enlightenment, they wanted to establish a written constitution that would guarantee natural rights and higher law, that this written document is a social contract between the people and its government, that power rests in the people through popular sovereignty, that there is proper representation, that the people elect their representatives, that there's direct representation, there's separation of powers in the branches, there are checks and balances between those entities, and legislative supremacy, that the legislative branch, this assembly, is most times bicameral, in few cases unicameral, that it is the basis of the power, that it'll select and elect the executive, the governors, the courts, and most state constitutions really didn't do much when it came to protecting property rights. They taxed their people, their citizens, much more than Britain did. And it was very messy with some of these state constitutions. But many of them, especially Virginia, had the Declaration of Rights, and that was very, very important, the idea that there are rights of the people. One of the best constitutions, and actually the framework for the Constitution itself, was in Massachusetts. And this is John Adams really working on this. He basically is the primary author of this Constitution. And it's broken down with a preamble. It has a Declaration of Rights, and there is the frame of government. And this frame of government is actually the most important part of the Massachusetts state constitution, in that the three branches are actually relatively equal. The governor is not elected by the legislature, he's elected by the people. And there are very balanced separation of powers here. And this worked out very, very well. And they even had a way of only certain, some people with very large property could vote for both the legislature and the governor. Then, as people, had less property, then they could only vote in the legislature, and then those with limited property could only vote for the lower house of the legislature. And this became the model for the United States Constitution eventually. But now we have the idea of written constitutions to guarantee a frame of government, instead of just thinking, oh, well, we're just going to base it on custom and tradition like we have been with Britain. Well, the Second Continental Congress, while they're also declaring independence and trying to run a war, are also trying to establish a national government, and they do that with the Articles of Confederation. And these delegates from each of the states establish a perpetual union between the states. And what I've done here, and I do this with my students, is this is your opportunity to analyze a primary source, such as the Articles of Confederation. And here, just the underlined part is the best part here. So in the preamble, it's the Articles of Confederation, perpetual union between the states, and it actually lists each and every state. So you can analyze this and ask the students, saying, what what is, when you talk about the Articles of Confederation, where does power really rest? Then you look at Article 2, and it says each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right. Very strong words when it comes to the idea of where power rests in this Articles of Confederation. And then in Article 3, one of the famous phrases of the Articles of Confederation is that the states enter into a firm league of friendship to, for the common defense and the mutual and general welfare. But it's just a firm league of friendship. What if I don't want to be your friend anymore? Or are we best friends? Is that going to last forever? Is the enemy of my enemy my friend? Type of, it's just it's firm, and it's just a league of friendship. I mean, that doesn't, I mean, it's nice, but it doesn't sound too secure. And it really provides more of that independence and sovereignty to the state. So here you can have the discussion with your students about who really is in charge of the national government, and it looks like it's the states. Let's talk about this. We're going to really dissect this. So here's what the Articles of Confederation, the federal government could do. It could borrow money, so that's great. It could create an army and a navy. It could declare war. It could establish post offices, and it could form treaties. So it does have strong foreign policy powers. Now, here's what it could not do, and we're going to get more into this. It could not tax the states, it could not tax the citizens, it could not tax goods, and it could not tax income. It could not institute a draft. It could not regulate interstate commerce, and it could not regulate a national currency. Why are these problems? Well, if you can't tax, you can't generate revenue. So how are you going to pay, say, for an army and a navy? How are you going to help to maintain these post offices that you can establish? You can't institute a draft because you're hoping the states will send troops to you. You can create an army and a navy, so now you just need manpower, and you can't, there's no conscription allowed by the national government, so you have to depend on the states to give you troops. Good luck with that. Can't regulate commerce, so now every state has their own unique rules for their own unique relationships with each state. There's no national currency. Each state has their own currency. That's going to be great economics. But you can't borrow money. So you can't generate revenue, so you borrow money. And all that's going to do is add debt. So great. You're off to a wonderful start, America. Well, let's talk about the good just for a bit. We're not going to get too much into this. Is that there was some good that came out of the Articles of Confederation, and that was the Northwest Territory. And the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 established the idea of the admission of new states. And we're going to follow this precedent from now on. And also, you have to understand that slavery is a big no-no in that Northwest Territory, and that's going to establish a precedent that will be adhered to for a while. But you can also, talk about the geography of the idea of, where slavery cannot be, and that's a pretty strong law to say that slavery cannot be north of the Ohio River in that Northwest Territory. But this is probably the best result of the Articles of Confederation. If they, out of all the laws, I think this is probably the best one. And let's talk about the bad problems. Okay, so one vote for each state regardless of size. So we have equal representation. Well, that's nice that Rhode Island has the same amount of representation that Virginia does. Despite Virginia having, being geographically larger, and of course having the largest population of all the states. So I'm sure that Rhode Island and its commerce and power and population and diversity, and I'm sure it really, really deserves to have equal footing with Virginia. Or hey, we're all the states. That's how it is. State is a state. So Congress is powerless to lay and collect taxes or duties, so there's no generation of revenue for the national government. They can't regulate foreign and interstate commerce; only the states can do that. So that's a mess. You're gonna have inconsistency. You're gonna have confused laws. Merchants are not gonna be very happy with that. Imagine being a British trader, a French trader, and one rule for Massachusetts and then another rule for South Carolina. It gets kind of confusing. There is no executive. There's no executive branch. There's no president to nobody. And there's no judiciary. It's all a unicameral legislature with equal representation of all the states. So there's no enforcement of laws, and there's no interpretation of laws. It all really comes down to the states and hoping that they will enforce it and that they can interpret it any way. If you're going to amend the Articles of Confederation, you need unanimous consent. All the states have to be in there. All it takes is just one state to say no. You need a supermajority to pass laws, 9 out of the 13 states, just to pass a law. And again, it's only a firm legal friendship. So you can have discussion with students about why these are problems and why this would lead to, a worse situation. And then there's the ugly. All right, so we got the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, I'm not going to get too much into all, how we get to Shays' Rebellion, but Shays' Rebellion is pretty much the event, the turning point where the smartest of the smart realize these articles suck, and we need to do something about them. And it really, one of the major issues with the Articles of Confederation was that it was economics. Economics was the major issue, not necessarily political in regards to the power and, oh man, we really need a strong central government. We need a strong central government, not just to keep the states in line, but to save the economy. And debt was rising, and Western farmers in Massachusetts were getting tired of it. They felt that they were being abused, kind of similar to what happened with Bacon's Rebellion. And it turned into a virtual civil war. And you couldn't really ask the federal government for help because they didn't they didn't have an army, and it was really up to Massachusetts. And if you're South Carolina, it's like, that's not my problem. I'm not going to pay for Massachusetts issues. So this really told some smart people like Alexander Hamilton that we need to do something about this. This is going to get out of hand. This infection is only going to spread. So we need to do something. So there's the Annapolis Convention. Then it basically leads to the Constitution Convention. Here's where we can talk about this. Everybody shows up except for Rhode Island. So that's interesting. It's secret. We're all in Philadelphia, and we're not trying to tell. We don't want to tell anybody. And we're trying to decide whether do we reform the articles or do we just start over. Now, I also like to talk to my students about who's there, who are the delegates. And we have 55 total delegates, all white males, mostly wealthy, middle-aged, professional, a lot of lawyers. 19 of them own slaves. And is this representative of the people? And that's the question you might want to ask and have that discussion, is that, wow, you have 55 all-white males from pretty great backgrounds. Some of them own slaves, and they're going to rewrite the government. Is that representative of the people? Are we okay with this? And a lot of students are like, well, it worked out. I go, well, yeah, hindsight 2020, it's fantastic. But what do we just fight a revolution for? I mean, we just, we have these state constitutions with Declaration of Rights and power rests in the people, and you have these men, these very well-to-do men, these elitists, secretly transforming the government without any kind of consent, really. So, all right. Well, one of the major issues was representation. And so you have the Virginia plan, or big state plan, and this established a bicameral legislature where the lower house elected by the people, and the upper house would be chosen by the lower house through nominations from the state legislatures. Okay, so pretty strong legislature still. Proportional representation in each house. Single one-term executive chosen by the Congress, and Congress also chose the judges. So interesting, they have an executive and judicial branch in this plan. However, the New Jersey plan, the small state plan, said, nope, we like to keep it unicameral, that legislature. Those state legislatures would choose the representatives. All right, so again, they're kind of sticking with the Articles of Confederation framework a bit, based on equal representation. And they also agree that there should be an executive and a judiciary. The Congress chooses the executive, and that the executive appoint the judges. So we have separation of powers. Not too much on the checks and balances, since there's still legislative supremacy here. But representation is a major issue here. So we get the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise or the Connecticut Plan. So we combine both the Virginia and New Jersey state plans into a bicameral legislature. The lower house is established as the House of Representatives based on proportional representation based on a state's population, and that they are directly elected by the people. Well, there we go. Great. We still got the people involved. And then the upper house, the Senate, has equal representation with 2 senators per state. And those senators are elected by their respective state legislatures. So we've got the people and we've got the states. So I'm sure everyone's happy now. But what else is there? Is there more to this Constitution? Well, yes, we have separation of powers. Article 1 will establish a legislative branch made up of the House and the Senate that we just saw. Then Article 2 establishes the executive branch was a president. And we have Article 3, which we have a Supreme Court and the judiciary. So we have pretty strong branches here, and we do have checks and balances. The Constitution will have certain powers that the Congress has, that the president has, and that the judiciary has, and that there are relationships between these 3 branches on how they can write, enforce, and interpret law. There's also the idea of federalism, and that there is a division of power between the national and the state governments, and basically this establishes that the national government is supreme. However, the states do have reserved powers, and whatever is not in the Constitution will be reserved to the states, and we'll talk about that in a second. So, here's the best part. So, what did the Constitution do? Did it solve the problems? Let's see. So the Articles problems were no power to tax, so they couldn't generate revenue, the national government. Well, Constitution solution is that Congress can lay and collect taxes. That's it. Solved. Well, the Articles said that the national government did not have the power to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Okay, well, the Constitution solution is yes, they can. The Congress has interstate regulatory powers and foreign regulatory powers, foreign trade and commerce regulatory powers. Just no export taxes. Solved. There's no executive branch. Well, we have a president chosen by an electoral college, so indirectly elected by the people, and serving 4-year terms with no limits for now. There's no judiciary. Yes, there is now. There's the national judiciary with the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Congress can establish the inferior federal courts. This is fantastic. I mean, this is awesome. Amendments need unanimous consent. So, well, the amendment process doesn't need unanimity, but it is still relatively difficult. You need 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and you need 3/4 of the state legislatures. Interesting. I always like to talk to my students about like who's not involved in that, and it's the people. But it's really Congress and the states. So who else is not involved? The president and the judiciary. So it's pretty close to the people when it comes to trying to change the Constitution. And before, it used to be 9 out of 13 just to pass a law, or supermajority. Now we have the presentment clause, which establishes that a law can be, as long as it's passed by a simple majority in both houses, and that the president's cool with it, in most cases. There we go. Awesome. So we have the Constitution solution. Way to go. Awesome. 55 white guys, elitists, that did this in secret. They fixed it. So, oh, right. There's this. Okay. Well, representation was still an issue, and the southern states felt that, well, the North has more population than the South, so what if we counted our slaves, and then some northern delegates caught that one and said, that's interesting. You don't even let them vote, and yet you want to count them as citizens so you have more representation. And I always like to argue with my students that the Civil War could have happened right here. And, you can use this to synthesize as one of the causes of the Civil War. And eventually, the Constitution is made up of compromises, and then you get the three-fifths compromise. So each slave is counted as three-fifths a person. There's a fugitive slave clause. However, the importation of slaves will be banned by 1808. So this Constitution had to include this to keep the relative peace. Now we're going to talk about ratification. In the Articles, it pretty much was easy in that the delegates from the states were already in this Continental Congress, and they passed it, except for that every state had to ratify it. This time, only 9 out of the 13 states have to ratify this new Constitution. So, what are we going to do? So, the Federalists, let's clarify it. This is not the Federalist Party at this point. These are just Federalists. These are delegates that believe in a strong central government that want the Constitution ratified. They are really well funded. They're very politically organized. They're favored. This Constitution is favored by merchants and the urbanites and industry. And people like Alexander Hamilton is your go-to Federalist on this one. You can throw in James Madison, very good author of the Federalist Papers. But let's talk about the Federalist Papers. And I like to use number 10, 51, and 78, but 10 and 51 for sure. And so the Federalist Papers are going to be published in newspapers, and they're going to be used to argue why the Constitution should be ratified. They're going to convince the people to convince their state conventions who are responsible for ratifying the Constitution. They're going to say, hey, this is why we need this. And Madison writes number 10, one of the famous Federalist paper, and he talks about factions. And factions are selfish, and there's nothing we can do about them. They exist, and they will always exist. And the only way we can get rid of them is if we get rid of liberty. If we get rid of liberty, because liberty is the faction what air is to fire. And if you take away air, there's no fire. Okay, great, you're not going to get burned. However, you won't have any air. And to faction, liberty, if we fought and died for liberty, and we have to have liberty. It's what it is. It's our rights. But that's just going to brew factions. So they're inevitable. Or everyone has the same interest. So good luck with that. So we can't get rid of factions without violating our principles. So what can we do? Well, we can try to limit the influence of factions. And the best way to do that, according to Madison, is this Constitution, this large federal republic. All right, this well-constructed union. And if you extend the sphere and you take in greater variety of parties and interests, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. He wants to avoid the tyranny of the majority. Then in Federalism number 51, written by James Madison, argues about the separation of powers. And I love this line, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. He's right. If everyone was pure soul, then government would not be necessary. But we have to have a government to protect the people. And he argues that there are so many guarantees and checks on the federal government in the branches. Even the Congress itself can check itself with the House and the Senate. If the House passes a crazy law, the Senate can be there to stop it. And if they both pass a law, then the executive, the president, can veto it. And if they both are in on it, then the judiciary can come in and save the day and rule it unconstitutional. Which segues into number 78, written by Alexander Hamilton, and really gives it a lot of power. And the Anti-Federalists really had an issue with this, that the judiciary had so much power to interpret laws. But that's its purpose, that we need that entity there. And a lot of them also had issue with the fact that they had life terms and that they weren't elected by the people. Well, let's talk about the Anti-Federalists and what their beef is. Well, they want states' rights, so they probably prefer the Articles of Confederation again. What they were really upset about was that, unlike state constitutions, this federal constitution did not have a list of rights, of guaranteed rights for the people. So they wanted a Bill of Rights attached to this. And you can see how some people feel. You can have this one person. I had rather be a free citizen of the free small republic of Massachusetts than an oppressed subject of the great American empire. I mean, this is great language. You can talk about the tone here and the purpose and the intended audience. Really get into this. But let's look at Brutus 1 here. It is insisted indeed that this constitution must be received, be it ever so imperfect. If it has its defects, it is said, they can be best amended when they are experienced. But remember, when the people once part with power, they can seldom or never resume it again but by force. Many instances can be produced in which the people have voluntarily increased the powers of their rulers, but few, if any, in which rulers have willingly abridged their authority. This is a sufficient reason to induce you to be careful in the first instance how you deposit the powers of government. And Brutus 1 really gets into the issues with Article 1, Section 8, and the powers of Congress, and he gets into the issue with the executive branch and how it's elected and what, especially its power with the as commander in chief, and then he gets into the judiciary that has basically unlimited power. There's really no check on that one, but we're able to get ratification. I mean, just check out the map. You can talk about this. I mean, look where the purple is where delegates supported ratification. Red is where delegates opposed ratification. Green, evenly defined. And just geographically, I mean, look at New York. New York is really a tough place to get this constitution. And I always talk to the students about how, you get 9, and they will get 9 pretty easily, but you can't just leave out New York and you can't leave out Virginia. And even though we get the 9, even without New York and Virginia, and eventually, they're going to sign on, but you got to get everybody. I mean, it's okay if Rhode Island holds out. They weren't even at the convention, but you got to have the two out of the three biggest states here, with Massachusetts, New York and Virginia have to be there. You got to have them. You got the Virginia is the largest state by population and geography. You got to get it in there. So, we do get ratification on June 21st, 1788, officially. I like to use the pillars about, how they're propped up and establishing the base of the federal government. Each this would always be published every time a state ratified the Constitution. And so, we have the Bill of Rights. We were able to convince state conventions on the bill on the Constitution by throwing in a Bill of Rights that this was promised. There you have it. The First Amendment, that's the famous one. The Fourth Amendment, searches and seizures. Fifth Amendment, due process. Sixth Amendment, speedy and fair trial and right to attorney. And then, of course, the 10th Amendment, the reserved powers to the states. So the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So that was kind of trying to give the Articles of Confederation crowd, throwing them a bone there. So this Constitution is a strong central government, and let's see, is it going to work? Okay, George Washington is the first president elected under this new Constitution, and let's see, are you going to prove it right? Are you going to prove it right? And, well, let's talk. We're going to do this very briefly. You got Hamilton's economic plan, you got the debt, and then you got the bank. And we're already off to here we go. It's going to get stronger. It's going to get stronger. It's going to get stronger. And states are going to be beholden to the central government. But eventually this works. And they're going to be able to compromise and get these plans through. But it's we need to get assume the debt and establish a bank to foster a economic prosperity. We have potential here, and under the articles we did not have enough power to control the economy and the commerce, so we got to have that. The Whiskey Rebellion. Whiskey Rebellion is a test. It is a test of the strength of the United States Constitution. And just as the Shays Rebellion proved that the Articles of Confederation were a failure, the Whiskey Rebellion was a pretty similar story. And Washington says, I am the commander in chief. The Constitution gives me these powers. I need to ensure domestic tranquility. And I'm going to go over there and take on these rebels, and I'll just show them. So, yeah, he has federal troops because this Congress can establish an army and a navy without state support, unlike the Articles. And he personally goes over there to Pennsylvania, and that was it. That's all she wrote. So, success. The United States Constitution will work. All right, so will it work? Well, Washington's farewell address, he warns us about political parties, partisan conflicts, the threat of sectionalism, and he established many precedents. And he was hoping that this would continue and that the nation wouldn't tear itself apart like it was about to under the Articles. So history will tell if the United States heeds Washington's warnings. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution. I hope this really helped you out and provided you some ideas to discuss the similarities and differences and why we needed a constitution as opposed to the Articles of Confederation. If you have any suggestions for any other ideas, let me know. Email me, contact me on the YouTube channel, or on the A Pushers group on Facebook. I welcome all comments. So, good luck.